you this evening. I'm going to talk about insects, which is kind of my favorite subject. I've been fascinated by insects all my life. I started wildlife gardening when I was about 8 or 9 years old, nearly half a century ago now, planting food plants for butterflies, and I'll touch back on that later. I don't think I was so strange in being interested in insects at an early age. Certainly my experience is that little kids love insects if they get the chance to interact with them. This is my youngest son, Seth, with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Sadly, Colin's is no longer with us, but anyway. But it's a source of constant sadness to me that most people seem to grow out of any childhood love of insects, and by the time they're teenagers and adults, their reaction to most insects is fright, is flapping around, trying to kill it. They think it's going to sting them or bite them or something. I came across this in the summer online. I didn't see this sign myself. It was actually on the University of South Wales campus. Don't unless you happen to be Welsh, you won't understand the top half, but its translation is pretty clear. It just epitomizes for me much of what is wrong with the world, this disconnect between people and nature. Warning, flying insects in this area, gives the impression that flying insects are terrifying creatures and that you should run for your life. Actually, all it was apparently some flying ants, swarming queen ants, completely harmless, but this sign would suggest otherwise. Anyway, I think insects are rather lovely, and I don't understand why anyone else wouldn't agree. Incredibly variable, diverse creatures. They've been around for about 480 million years, which is an awful long time, twice as long as the oldest dinosaurs, which has given them a long time to speciate, and which is why they come in such an amazing variety of colors and shapes and sizes and so on. We know of about 1.1 million species of insect. They make up about 70% of known species on our planet. And what's really interesting is we discover new ones all the time, and it's estimated there might be 3 or 4 million more species of insect that we haven't even discovered yet on our planet. Isn't that amazing? Anyway, sadly, as I'm sure everyone is aware, insects are not doing so well. They've survived nearly 500 million years. They've survived 5 extinction events that went before. We're now in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event. This uniquely for mass extinction events driven by a species on the planet, us, of course. Now, I don't want to dwell on the doom and gloom, but I did think perhaps I should show you one example of an insect that's not doing so well. I could have shown you graphs for British butterflies or German insects or whatever, but let me show you what's happened to one of my favorite insects. This is a lovely little creature called the shrill carder, a type of bumblebee, which used to be pretty common all over the southern half of certainly England and Wales. Didn't quite, well, just about made it into Scotland in its heyday. But as time's gone on, this bee has been disappearing. I became interested in what was happening with rare bumblebees in about 2000. And I went looking for this bee in one of its last remaining haunts, which was Salisbury Plain there. And I spent a whole summer looking, and eventually found some. Beautiful little things with a high-pitched buzz, which is where the name comes from. But anyway, that Salisbury Plain population has now gone. And the one on the Somerset Levels to the west is teetering on the edge of extinction. This bee is disappearing before our eyes and could easily go extinct in Britain within a few years. Interestingly, actually, it is relevant to gardeners, because if you happen to particularly live in East London, north or south of the Thames, then you might get one of these things in your garden. One of their last strongholds is in the Thames estuary. Anyway, I won't dwell on the doom and gloom. Let's turn to other matters. Why does it matter that insects are declining? Well, as well as making up the bulk of life on Earth, they're food for a huge number of birds and bats and freshwater fish, lizards, amphibians, and so on. But probably much more importantly, they're involved in all sorts of ecological processes, all sorts of things like recycling of dung and dead bodies, and leaves and tree trunks and you name it, pretty much any organic material. They're also really important biocontrol agents. I think that the future of farming is to move much more towards encouraging natural enemies rather than using pesticides. They distribute seeds, they keep the soil healthy, they do all sorts of stuff. Of course, the one thing, most of this people never notice and are blithely unaware of, but there is one thing insects do that I think most people are aware of, which is they pollinate. Many people think this is all done by bees, but actually it's done by a whole swathe of insects, lots of different flies, butterflies and moths, wasps, beetles, and so on, all busy pollinating wildflowers. About 80% of the world's wildflowers depend on insects to pollinate them. And about 3/4 of our crops, including lots of the garden plants we grow and the vegetables we grow in our vegetable patch, depend upon insects. So you may have seen this before, but we've become used to fruits and veg being readily available 12 months of the year in the supermarkets. Things wouldn't look so good if we didn't have insect pollinators. The large majority of our crops would give much smaller yields. Everything from, well, most fruits and veg and coffee and chocolate. There was a recent study just came out last week, which calculated that about 500,000 people a year die attributable to a deficiency of insect pollinators, reducing the availability of healthy fruit and veg, meaning their diets are poorer, they're more likely to die from poor diet-related illnesses. It's pretty, I don't know, some very complicated calculations, but the most telling point, I think, is that this is going to get worse if insects keep declining and the human population is rising, and those two things are pushing in opposite directions, and something's going to give, and it'll sadly be us. Anyway, so we have a really selfish reason to look after insects. But before I talk about how we can do that in our gardens, I also wanted to say something else about this. So it's easy to justify why we need pollinators and recyclers and so on, from a sort of selfish point of view. But I think we shouldn't just look after other species on our planet because they do something for us. It seems quite a sort of selfish approach. And it isn't why I care about insects. And it worries me because I think there are lots of insects that maybe don't do anything for us, but don't they still deserve to live? And here's just a rather random example. This is the St. Helena giant earwig, the biggest earwig that ever lived, which, as you might imagine, lived on St. Helena in the South Atlantic. It's been extinct now since the 1960s, or that was the last time someone saw one. And it went extinct, and there were no repercussions, so far as we know. It wasn't doing anything vital that needed to be done. It just quietly disappeared. It used to live in seabird colonies and scavenging for scraps of food, probably. Anyway, it doesn't matter to us from an economic point of view that there's no longer a giant earwig on St. Helena, but it seems to me that the world is a sadder place, and that this giant earwig deserved to live, whatever it did, and whether it did anything useful or not. And likewise, all the rest of life on Earth. I think maybe we need, to sort of animal rights in the same sense that we have human rights, that we should respect all of our fellow creatures. Anyway, I'm probably rambling, but all of this is to say that we need to do a better job of looking after our insects. And so how can we do that? Finally, I might get to the point. Well, the good news is there's lots we can do, and actually looking after insects is much easier than looking after many other rare creatures, because Most of them are still around. The majority of species haven't gone extinct. And unlike pandas or white rhinos, they breed really fast. If you just provide them with the right habitat, they can spring back in no time. And because they live all around us, they live in our gardens and our parks, we can all get involved in doing something to help, especially, of course, if we have a garden. And I guess many of you share my kind of dream that if we can somehow persuade most gardeners in this country to garden for wildlife, that would really make a difference. There are something like 22 million private gardens in the UK, and they cover an area of about 400,000 hectares, which is a lot of land. It's a bigger area than our nature reserve cover. And I mean, just imagine if they were all wildlife friendly, and we could get the council on board so that the road verges and the roundabouts and the parks and the cemeteries were all wildlife friendly as well. Then that would really make a difference. So there's great potential, and what's exciting is it's already happening. There are, as we just heard, 100,000 people signed up on the Wildlife Forum Facebook page. There are loads of people making their gardens wildlife friendly. We just obviously need more. The more the merrier, I would say. But we should also remember that while many of us are madly planting wildflowers and encouraging nature in our gardens, there are quite a few people going in the opposite direction. This sadly is becoming a common sight. There was a recent survey that suggested that 8% of British gardens now have plastic grass, which is what you can see here in this awful sterile wasteland. Now, I don't need to persuade you, I'm sure, that this is a bad thing. I could rant on about plastic grass and how evil and terrible for the planet it is, but I'll spare you. But nonetheless, we should be aware that this is happening and ready to argue against it. And I wish we could somehow arrive at a point where this was socially unacceptable, that the neighbours would peer over the fence and scowl in distaste at what this person has done. I didn't take this picture, but I did take this one. That, believe it or not, aside from the plastic lawn, is a plastic hedge. It's a plastic box hedge. Would you believe it? You can buy plastic hedges now. Good Lord, what are we doing with all? I also saw recently online that you can now get disinfectant and cleaner for your plastic lawn, which makes your lawn smell like a fresh mown meadow. How ironic is that? Anyway, so I'm sure none of you do any of these horrific things, but many of us are probably guilty of slightly less obvious environmental harms associated with the way we garden. So on the one hand, we need to focus on what positive things we can do in our garden. We also need to minimize the negatives, the impacts. So, you know, gardening can be very green, but it can also be not so green, depending on how exactly you do it. You know, if as many people's idea of gardening is to drive to a giant garden centre and get a trolley and buy loads of stuff, you know, annual bedding plants in disposable plastic pots, probably grown in a peat-based compost, probably sprayed with pesticides and almost certainly treated with lots of fertilizers. And they might get a sack of artificial fertilizer and a peat-based compost and maybe some bug clear and some Roundup herbicide while they're at it. All of which obviously is pretty awful for the environment. On the other hand, if you're gentle with your garden and don't do most of those things, then it's amazing how much life it can support. There's this lovely example from Leicester, a lady called Jenny Owen, who spent 35 years counting and identifying everything she could find in her little urban Leicester garden. And her species list after 35 years, amazing, you know, top marks for persistence. Anyway, her species list was 2,673 different species, if I remember correctly. It's just amazing, you know, that's I mean, to think that we can have thousands of species living in our back garden. I might have guessed that sort of number would be how many insects you might find in a little bit of rainforest or something, but no, this was an eighth of an acre of urban Leicester. Quite astonishing. Anyway, so you could probably tell I get quite excited about this. If you want, I haven't got time tonight, obviously, to go into depth of all the different things we can do to make our gardens wildlife friendly. We'd be here for a long time. But if you want to know more, just to plug my book. Steve's already done that, but I have written books. Or you can check out my YouTube channel, which is obviously much cheaper, where I've got lots of hints and tips about how to make bug hotels and which plants to grow and so on and so on. While I'm advertising things, I'd also mention the Buzz Club, which if you want to get involved in citizen science to find out more about which interventions work best in encouraging wildlife. Buzz is a very tiny organization that I'm involved with. In its early days, slightly disorganized, I'll confess, but it's free to join. And if you're interested in getting involved in doing a bit of science in your garden, then do consider that. Anyway, so what are my sort of key messages about making your garden more wildlife friendly? There's a few key points I'd like to try and make in the remainder of my talk. Firstly, and I think this is maybe the most important one, and it seems to me that it's often forgotten in wildlife gardening, obvious though it is that generally speaking, where you can, native plants will support more wildlife than non-natives. That's not to say you should pull up all your non-native plants. I'm sure very few people would be willing to do that anyway. But there've been a couple of studies, one by the RHS and one that I was involved in, which is the title of it's down the bottom there. That's, by the way, is open access if you want to see more detail. It was a big trial looking at pollinator visits to different plants, both native and non-native, and we found that there were, on average, more pollinators attracted to native plants than non-natives. Not a huge difference, and there are some non-natives that are spectacularly attractive to pollinators. But if I could just show you a few of the winners. So in this big trial we ran, the 3 most attractive plants to pollinators among the native plants were these, probably plants you've already got in your garden if you're a wildlife gardener, but if you haven't, think about growing them. Number 1, marjoram is just a really fantastic plant for pollinators. A nice, lovely native plant. It doesn't just attract bees, it attracts butterflies and hoverflies and beetles and all sorts, a real diversity of insects. Then there's Viper's bugloss, which is much more of a bee plant. Bumblebees go crazy for it. And greater knapweed on the bottom right there, which is just a beautiful plant. Looks really nice in a herbaceous border, even in a very formal garden. In fact, all of these plants look nice in a formal garden if you're tidy-minded. Anyway, so native plants on average slightly better for pollinators, but I don't think that's the key reason for growing native plants. Actually, it's herbivorous insects that benefit most from this. So I think this isn't as widely understood as perhaps it should be. When I was a kid, planting my little wildlife garden, I learned that if you didn't grow the right plants, then you'd never get butterflies to come and breed in your garden because they're very specific. They're caterpillars, will only eat certain plants, and that's also true of many other herbivorous insects. They're very fussy, unlike pollinators. So just as an example, the orange tip there, lovely familiar garden butterfly, it only lays its eggs on 2 or 3 species of cabbage family plant, including lady's smock. So if you grow lady's smock in your garden, there's a really good chance you'll get this butterfly breeding in your garden. If you don't grow it, then there's 0 chance that you'll have orange tips breeding in your garden. Every native plant you add to your garden is probably food to a cluster of insects, native insects. And take this to its extreme. Imagine you plant a eucalyptus tree in your garden. You're lucky you've got room for a tree. Plant a eucalyptus tree. It will basically support absolutely nothing unless you've got a pet koala. Utterly useless from a wildlife point of view. Whereas plant an oak tree, or any native tree really, but an oak is a fine example, it will support hundreds of species of native insect. So wherever you can, squeeze in native plants, including, if you can bring yourself to, of course. And I wish we could do a sort of PR job to sell some of these, to rebrand some of these plants, which are loathed by many people, regarded, you know, if I mean, ragwort in particular is demonized as this terrible plant that slaughters thousands of horses every year, which is not true. Anyway, these are all native wildflowers that are very, very good for pollinators, rather beautiful, I would say, and yet generally regarded as not suitable for a garden. I've got all of them in my garden, but then my garden's a bit of a shambles. But you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden, just like that, by calling them more wildflowers. I did come across this. You may have seen this online. There was a lady called Sophie LeGill, lived in East London somewhere, who recently started this More Than Weeds campaign to highlight the botanical diversity under our feet, in the cracks in the pavement in London. She identified, I think it was about 40 different species of plant growing in the cracks in the pavement in her area of East London. And to draw people's attention to them, she chalked their names on the pavement. I thought that was really cool. Sadly, instead of lovely, interesting plants growing in cracks in the pavement, we very often see this kind of thing. I hope you're all pesticide free in your garden. I know perhaps not every wildlife gardener is, but most are these days. So this is an example where the local council many of them still employ groups of people to drive around looking for something green, and if they see it, they spray it with herbicide, usually Roundup. It just seems bonkers to me. I mean, to me that looks awful. It would have looked much nicer if it was green and alive, and it would have supported a little bit of life, but now it's dead. Anyway, so aside from just being kind of needless environmental vandalism or waste of taxpayers' money, there's also a sort of sinister side to this, which is that the chemical they use, Roundup, contains glyphosate as the active ingredient. It's pretty clear evidence it's a carcinogen, that it's been linked to cancer in humans, and yet we spray it in parks, pavements, children's playgrounds, and so on. That does seem rather bonkers to me. I personally think we should ban pesticides for garden use, for urban use completely. There are lots of towns all around the world that have done this. The first was a small town in Canada about 30 odd years ago that went pesticide free over concern about human health risks of using pesticides, and it's coping perfectly fine. France went pesticide free in 2018 in urban areas. And, Paris is still standing, so we could get rid of them. I'm guessing most of you listening don't use them anyway. But I just wanted to warn you of a couple of other ways you might accidentally bring pesticides into your garden. The first is through buying ornamental plants in the garden centre, and I touched on this earlier. We published a study in 2017 showing that nearly every single plant in your local garden centre is contaminated with, it's been sprayed with pesticides, often many pesticides. We had one plant, it was a little heather plant that was being sold as bee friendly. It had 10 different pesticides in it. Most of them contain insecticides of one sort or another, and yet they're sold by garden centres as perfect for pollinators or bee friendly or whatever, which is really sad. Not the RHS's fault, I should say, but do beware that those beautiful plants in the garden centre might not be as good for wildlife as you'd hoped. And then just the final pesticide-related issue. Do also be aware, if you've got a dog or a cat, and many of us do, that the flea treatments that are often recommended by your vet, these spot-ons that you put on the neck of the dog or cat, these are really potent insecticides, really, really potent. They're neurotoxins. They're kind of like Novichok for bees. The one on the left there, the active ingredient is a neonicotinoid insecticide. and the dose you're supposed to put on a dog, a medium-sized dog every month, is enough to kill 60 million bees. And it's a really persistent chemical that washes off the dog and goes into streams, into the environment. We recently found that these products, every single river in England is contaminated with one, and usually both of these flea treatments, which is really quite concerning. Anyway, enough of pesticides. I've just got a few minutes left to make a few other points. Firstly, and this is a really obvious one I'm sure you're all aware of, don't mow so much. If we could persuade people to allow their lawns to be a little shaggier, it makes a huge difference. Leave the mower in the shed for as long as possible. Get a deck chair out instead. Make yourself a cappuccino, gin and tonic or whatever, and sit and relax. This is my lawn, and I haven't planted any wildflowers. I didn't sow a seed mix. This is just all lovely flowers that were waiting for me to stop mowing, so for a chance to pop up and flower. And of course, it's not just lawns, but there's a lot of council-owned amenity grasslands too, things like parks and road verges, which could also, with a bit of imagination, be managed very differently. This is a lovely example. It used to be a very boring road verge, which has been planted by wildflowers. This is up in Stirling in Scotland. Imagine if every road verge, every roundabout was like that, and we can all get involved in badgering our local council to do this kind of thing. If we're going to do that, though, maybe we should think first about what seed mix to use. Now, wildflower seed mixes is a big and complicated topic, and I've got about 2 minutes to cover it. But there is one key point I wanted to make. So there are at least, very crudely, 3 categories of wildflower seed commonly used in gardens in the UK. The first are what are often called pictorial meadow mixes, which have been promoted in recent years as providing lots of colour very quickly in the first year. They're mostly annual plants, very brightly coloured annual plants, some of them reasonably good for pollinators. They were planted around the Olympic Park in 2012 very extensively, and there was lots of praise for how beautiful they were. But many people think this is a wildflower seed mix, and I've even seen some of Thompson and Morgan until recently had a wildflower seed mix, which was one of these mixes full of non-native plants. There are not many natives in here. It's Chinese plants, North American plants, and so on. They're okay for pollinators, but from a herbivorous insect point of view, as I explained earlier, these are pretty hopeless. The second kind of mix that's often used are arable weed mixes, cornflowers, poppies, corn cockles, corn marigolds, and so on, which are sort of arguably native. Some people say they're not native, but it's probable that they came in with Neolithic farmers 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, which it seems to me to be a bit harsh to describe them as non-native. They've certainly been here a long time. Again, they're annuals, they flower really quickly, they provide a lovely splash of colour in the first year, but they will then die off. They're not a long-term option. For me, what we should be encouraging people to grow as much as possible are native perennial wildflower mixes that recreate the beautiful wildflower meadows, the lowland hay meadows, the chalk downlands and so on that we used to have huge amounts of in Britain, and that sadly were almost entirely destroyed in the 20th century. We lost 97% of this habitat, but it's not impossible to recreate on a small scale in your garden or on a bigger scale if you're lucky enough to have a field. And this is, for me, there's a lot more subtleties to it than that. There are slightly different mixes suitable for different soil types and so on, but broadly, if you're going to sell a wildflower seed mix, try and get hold of a native perennial mix like this. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think ideally we should be rewilding our gardens and ourselves somewhat if we can. We certainly need to stop trying to kill and control everything, and I'd love it if we could learn to live with nature as part of nature rather than seeing ourselves as above it and nature as a commodity to just use and abuse as we like. You know, we often forget that we live on this rock hurtling through space. Quite an extraordinary thing, with millions of species clinging to its surface, most of them most of them insects. There is no planet B. It's everything to us, and we should look after it. And it's astonishing that really how reckless we are being. Whatever Elon Musk thinks, we're not going to go and live on Mars. The sad truth is there's a really good chance that our children and grandchildren are going to have a much harder life because of the way we've overexploited the planet. And we'd all do anything for our children, it seems, apart from leave them a decent planet to live on. Anyway, we can do better. And I think a brilliant place to start is by getting everybody involved in looking after the many, many insects that live all around us in our gardens. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Okay, Dave, thank you so much for that inspirational talk. I've had a real job actually keeping on top of all the questions that have been coming in for you. So I'm not going to be able to get through all of them, but I'm going to do my best to get a selection to you. So thanks to everyone for all those questions. I'm going to start with a question from Maggie. And she's asking, well, she's saying that she likes to record insects in her garden, and she wants to know how important is it to scientists and why that citizens record insects in their own gardens.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of apps these days for recording, and it helps to build up a picture of the distribution of our insects, which is really helpful. We can plot maps. I showed examples of how these kind of maps have highlighted the peril that the shrill carder is in, for example. Most of those records come from amateur recorders spotting them and recording them and sending in records. So those individual records are useful, but even better if you're really enthusiastic, join one of the long-term recording schemes like the Bumblebee Conservation Trust's Bee Walk scheme, if you can identify bumblebees, or the Butterfly Conservation Trust's Butterfly Transect scheme, because those provide long-term data on abundance of insects as well, which is even more valuable to scientists.
Right, thanks Dave, and thanks Maggie for that question. So the next one I'm going to give you is from Marjorie in Seaford. So Marjorie is involved in a community group, and she's interested in making some solitary bee hotels. But she's read advice saying that they're quite difficult to maintain, and she's wondering whether or not it's a good idea. What are your thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, no, have a go. They're easy to make, or you can buy them. But I mean, it is very simple. Just get a block of wood and drill a bunch of holes. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 millimeter holes, and a range of sizes as deep as you can, and stick it on a south-facing wall or fence, and not on a tree. And there's a really good chance they'll be occupied. I've got about 15 bee hotels of various sizes dotted around my garden, and I get a huge population of mason bees every spring, and then leafcutter bees a bit later in the year. It did take a couple of years to start to build up. The first year I put my hotel up, nothing happened, and I was very sad. But then the next year I had a few mason bees, and the year after that I had a lot of mason bees. They don't really, there's a debate about maintenance. Some people say you should clean them out every winter, but many designs don't really allow that, including the one I just mentioned of drilling holes in a block of wood. In nature, they're not cleaned out every winter. If you don't clean them out, there is the danger that you may get some parasites, but for me, the parasites are all part of biodiversity and part of the fun. So I just leave mine to see what happens, and I seem to have a good mix of bees and parasitic wasps and all sorts of other interesting little beasties.
Lovely, thanks Dave. It sounds like you're going to be busy there, Marjorie. Okay, so next question is going to be from Angela, and she's interested in whether there was any evidence that there was a higher prevalence of flying insects during lockdown, anecdotal or otherwise.
Yeah, sorry. I should have said to the last question, I've made some YouTube videos about making a bee hotel, should you be interested. Lockdown, yeah. We certainly noticed more insects during lockdown, and but it's very hard to know whether that was because we all had more time on our hands and more time in our gardens or walking locally, or whether there was really more insects. And it's possible that the lack of human activity, the lack of traffic, the lack of pollution benefited insects. I think it's more likely that it was just our perception, the fact we had more time to notice them. It's a bit too early for the long-term data sets that I mentioned, things like the butterfly data and the bumblebee data. It's a bit early at this point to analyze them to see if the lockdown years are a kind of blip or anything shows up. I guess time will tell on that one.
Thanks, Dave. And yeah, thanks again, Angela, for that question. Okay, so next, I think I'm going to go to Alistair, who's from the King's Tainton Swifts group in Devon. Hope I've got that right. So Alistair's having some problems with the local council being a bit overzealous with the mowing in one of his local green spaces. And he's wondering if you think sort of conservation organisations might be able to get together, appeal to local authorities, and it maybe put something like a third of parks on some sort of hay meadow regime or something like that. And yeah, have you got any thoughts on that, or examples of where that might have been done successfully?
Yeah, there are lots of examples where local community groups have made a big difference. I mean, I showed a picture of that road verge covered in arable weed, beautiful arable weed mix up in Stirling, and that was planted by a group of local people who mostly frustrated gardeners who wanted to help nature, and they basically badgered the local council into letting them spend their weekends digging over bits of amenity grassland in parks and road verges and roundabouts and so on, and planting them with wildflowers. And it just came from them being persistent. So there are lots of other similar groups. In fact, the one in Stirling calls itself On the Verge, and recently it's spawned On the Verge Cambridge, and then there's also now On the Verge Seaford on the south coast. So why not set up your own On the Verge? Actually, that's a good idea. If you Google them, you could contact them for advice, or Plant Life, the bigger charity. They've really been championing No Mow May and better management of road verges and so on. So they could probably give helpful advice as well.
Great, thanks, Dave. Actually, we're going to be hearing from Plant Life shortly. So yeah, thanks for the plug. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions, and then we'll have a short break before the second set of speakers. So next question's coming from Jake. He's from Newcastle Emlyn, and he's noted that we're facing maybe a 3.5 degree temperature rise with global warming, and he's wondering how you think this will impact insect populations.
Yeah. Hi, Jake. I mean, so some insects are benefiting. We're getting some continental European species colonizing Britain, but it tends to be the more adaptable, more abundant insects that are responding positively to climate change, including pest insects, things like mosquitoes, which are spreading northwards in Europe, carrying malaria with them, which is not so good. Sadly, the majority of insects seem to be not being harmed by climate change. Bumblebees, for example, my sort of pet subject, they're well adapted to cool weather, and the projections suggest that most British bumblebees, if we do reach 3.5 degrees, most of the common species of British bumblebee won't be living in Britain anymore. Whether they will be able to move northwards is anyone's guess. The basic problem, sorry, this is a bit of a long answer, but historically the climate changed and species moved with it. You know, they would move as it got warmer, they would move gently northwards and then southwards again as it got colder. But the problem this time is twofold. One is it's happening really fast, and the second is that formerly insects were living in huge tracts of intact habitat, so there was somewhere for them to move to, whereas now most insects are living in little islands, nature reserves and so on, and they have to kind of jump to the next little patch of habitat to the north rather than moving across. So that basically they have to make their way across inhospitable farmland, factories, motorways, or whatever to find somewhere to move to. So it's much harder for them to move than it used to be. And for many, I fear climate change may be the final straw, sadly.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Right, I'm going to finish with two questions rolled into one, if I may, related to the pesticides issue that's generated quite a lot of interest. The first question is coming from Carolyn, and she's wondering if you can recommend any sort of alternative safe products for keeping pets flea-free, I should say. So anything alternative. And then a related question, and this is thinking about pesticides in plants. So Esther, she likes to grow plants from seeds, and is that still a problem? Are sort of seeds also treated with pesticides? So two different but related pesticide questions just to finish off with. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, sure. The plants one is nice and easy. Growing from seeds is fine. Or plant swap with your friends and neighbours, or find an organic nursery. There are a few, like Rosie Bee Nursery, you can find online that supply organic bee-friendly plants. So it's not that difficult to avoid those ones in the local garden centre. If you've got a dog or cat, the first thing is don't treat it with a flea treatment unless it actually has fleas. Most animals don't have fleas most of the time, and yet some vets recommend you use them every month, and I think that's more of a profit-making recommendation than based on any good science, and that's not just coming from me, that's coming from some vets I know as well. But if your dog or cat does get fleas and you feel you have to do something, then it's not sure, but various vets I've spoken to think that the tablet flea treatments you can get, things like Bravecto, are probably better for the environment than these spot-ons. So look out for a product called Bravecto. You could also try, if your animal hasn't yet got fleas, but you're worried about it, I don't know whether it works, but you can get diets that are supposed to make your dog unattractive to fleas. The very one of them I can remember is the name is Billy No Mates. I don't know whether it works, but it might be worth a try. But if they do get fleas and there's nothing else for it, then go for Bravecto rather than those spot-ons.
Fantastic, Dave. Thanks so much. I see actually someone's mentioned Billy No Mates in the chat as well. So that sounds like a good recommendation. Right.